All right. Happy Tuesday, everyone, and welcome to another Learning Tech Talks where, usually we're exploring the landscape of learning tech and workplace tech. Today is going to be just me talking. I've spent a lot of time. I cannot believe it is November 1st. We are 2 months away from 2023. And so more recently, I've been spending a lot of time thinking about what's next in 2023 and what are some of the things, not only that I'm thinking about as a learning leader, but also based on my reflections over the past 12, 18 months and some of the biggest things I encounter in the conversations I have with other leaders or learning leaders. What are some things we should be thinking about and considering as we move into and prepare for the new year? So that's going to be the topic at large today. A couple housekeeping items before I get going. And as you're joining in, I will be taking comments and questions live, so feel free to jump in along the way, as I always encourage people to do. But before we get started, a couple housekeeping items, just to give you an update on the plan for the remainder of 2022 in through January 2023. I have content lined up through the first week of December, and then I am going to likely take a break from live sessions through January, taking a little bit of a sabbatical. I am on the fence on whether I'm going to pre-record some content that I will share or if I'm going to do a 2022's greatest hits. So if I hear from folks, if there are some topics, I've got a little bit of time since it's just November now. If there are some topics or things that would be helpful for folks, I may be able to put together some pre-recorded content that I will stream during that kind of time away. If not, I will likely just pull some of the top episodes based on stats, based on data that I have from folks anecdotally, but also just from the actual data and statistics. So that's what will likely happen through January 2023, taking a little bit of a break there. And so this month, November, will be my last monthly newsletter until likely January or February of 2023. So if you get my monthly newsletter with all the updates and that, this will be my final one for 2022. I would also encourage you to join the community if you have not already. For those of you who are in there, thanks. It's a rapidly growing group. I love the discussions and the different things that we have going on. I've also added some new things to the community only. There's spaces are launching, I think, today. So some interesting, exciting capabilities in the platform I use on top of that. But I also have a community-only podcast that I launch once a month as well, just answering some of the biggest questions and things I'm seeing. So if you're not part of that already, I would highly encourage you to do that. And then another thing, shout out to Kevin Alster. Yesterday, he had reached out to me, has been following my content for a bit and said, do you happen to do chapters on YouTube? And it was something I was doing on another platform for a bit, and then it just got away from me and people weren't going to that location. But I have since added chapters, or I'm starting to add chapters. I've gone back a couple months and added chapters to this. As it's long form content, I recognize sometimes it can be hard to know where exactly to jump in and where are some of the points that are most interesting. So for several episodes back and moving forward, if you're watching this post live, you can actually see the chapters and some of the biggest segments of the content. So thank you, Kevin, first of all, for recommending it, but also taking the time to send me some screenshots and show me exactly how that works on YouTube in terms of actually editing it. So appreciate that. That's it for housekeeping items. And thank you, Kristen, for the topic. So I will take a look at that. It's a really good question. So we'll talk about that. I'll maybe record something on that and plan that for those times when I will be out. In terms of flow, there are 3 areas that I want to focus on primarily, and I'll get into the weeds on what I'm talking about in this, but just to give you an idea of the general flow of today's conversation, 3 of the biggest things that I'm going to highlight. I know a lot of the conversations I have are around L&D and workplace technology. I will absolutely highlight that, but I actually put that at the end because these episodes, I often run out of time. And I think there's a fair amount of stuff that I talk about related to technology. There's 2 things that I think actually almost, I don't want to say supersede, but I want to focus on first. So the first one that I'll get into, just to give you a structure of the conversation, is going to be talking about L&D operations. And what I mean by that is our internal L&D operation model and how we actually come to market and some of the things I'm seeing, the way I'm thinking about it, and opportunities I see. I'm also going to focus on skill analytics and the measurement conversation. Those may sound like the same thing. I think there is a distinction between the two, which I will get into when I get to that topic. And then the third is L&D technology, which is really broken into two parts, which I will get to when I get to that section, assuming I have enough time. But along the way, like always, I would highly encourage everyone to ask your questions. If you need clarification, sometimes I know that when I get rolling, it can be I really get rolling. So don't hesitate to stop me along the way or ask for clarification or challenge if you've had different experiences. So let me jump into it in terms of the L&D operations and why I think this is a real opportunity, but also an area that often goes overlooked and why it matters. So like I said before, to me, L&D operations is the way we operate as a function, the very framework by which we work with our stakeholders, the way we develop products, the way we engage with the organization. And this is often something I see vastly overlooked. We tend to get distracted with the technologies we do or the projects that we focus on or the skills or the trends that are happening. And in reality, a lot of times, if you were to dig into how does work get done within an L&D function, that oftentimes is not crystal clear, or if it's clear on paper, how it works in practice is not necessarily consistent or in line with what's on paper. And I think that it's very limiting to an L&D function for a couple of reasons. First of all, one, it's just hard to articulate the defenses behind why things take the time they do or why you're prioritizing the things that you're prioritizing. But also, our limitation, our capability is capped by how well we run as an operation. And so sometimes I see us pursuing these really high end, high structure, I don't know, complicated ways of doing things when at the end of the day, our house isn't in order. And to me, this is something that I personally am heavily focused on with in every org that I've been in. It's one of the first areas that I tend to focus. Now, this doesn't mean that everything stops while we figure this out, but it is something where we put an intentional focus on, first of all, one, even just defining what is our operating model? What does our operating model look like? And we may say, well, we use Addy or we use SAM or this and that. To me, that's not getting into a level of granularity of things like, what are the handoffs between teams? When do we make decisions about pulling people in versus making decisions without necessarily pulling all our stakeholders in? How do we define who gets involved in what spaces? And not only is this really valuable for the overall operations of your team, but even in terms of engagement from your team members and role clarity and understanding what is expected of them to hold teams accountable to a higher degree of performance. If you don't have a crystal clear operating model and understand this is what is expected of XYZ group or these individuals on these teams, this is when they get engaged, this is when they hand things off, this is what's expected of them when they are engaged, it becomes very difficult for us to hold ourselves to a standard of excellence that really, in my opinion, is required to thrive in today's environment. Now, this can sound like an exercise of futility of saying, well, there's just so much complexity. And I've heard all the excuses. I myself have been guilty of giving them. Well, there's too much nuance to the work we do. Well, the business is always changing. We can't get people to follow our process. What I've learned over time is that it is possible, but it takes a lot of work. And I think this is something that every L&D function would be well spent as we go into 2023, taking some time to take a close look at this and say, first of all, one, have we defined our operating model? Is it clear to everyone in our organization? Where are those breakdowns? And then also, is it clear to our stakeholders? Do they understand how they engage with us, how we work with them, how our processes work? Now, this is not necessarily everyone's bread and butter or something that we always, a lot of times I find in our industry, we like the more creative, fun side of things. This is not necessarily on that side of the house. So if this is not your comfort zone, this is certainly something where you can partner with functional counterparts, lean on the people on your teams who really do focus on this. Talk to other groups outside of your enterprise to try and find out, how are you operating? And again, going beneath the surface of, well, we follow XYZ process. Get into the ins and outs. Does that necessarily mean you need to get to a level of granularity where you have an SOP that is overly rigid? No. And I think that's sometimes where I've seen this fall down, is this gets to a SOP level. This is exactly how everything's supposed to work. Becomes very bureaucratic, over bloated with forms and documents that have to be signed off and handed off. That's just not realistic to sustain. But getting to a point where everyone's clear, this is how things work. Now, I will tell you this is very much tied to your org design and the skills within your team. Historically, there's often been a tendency in our industry to paint L&D with a very broad stroke brush and to say, well, L&D professionals, they need to be good at delivering and administrating and designing and change management and technology. It's been a bit of a MacGyver function. And I think one of the things that I've seen as things have progressed and the needs of businesses have changed, as the needs of employees have changed, is actually we need to be more specialized and focusing on what are the skills that are going to drive this so we can get greater clarity on our operating model. It also allows us to go deeper into the skills. Now, I'm not going to get into all the skills I think are critical to an L&D function. If you haven't, I would highly recommend you check out the Skills of L&D episode I did a couple months ago. I will put that in the queue of replays during my time out. So I won't get into those skills, but by specializing, it allows you to actually have that operating model where it is clear and you can say, this team really needs to develop in this area, or this group on our team really needs to focus on this. One of the biggest pushbacks I get when I talk to either smaller organizations or organizations that may not have a large, robust learning and development team is, well, what happens when you may not have the luxury of a large L&D team where you can break your organization structure into highly specialized pieces? What I would say to that is take it one step at a time. I have, in many different orgs and over the years, taken this. I've been in teams where I've only had a handful of people. And can you go to a level of specialization where maybe you have a dedicated learning business partner and a dedicated instructional designer that focuses on graphics versus one that does video production? No, of course not. I think that level of specialization is a luxury that it is fantastic to aspire to. And I actually think that every organization, regardless of size, can get to that point, because as you clean up your operating model, one of the benefits of doing this really well is the fact that you have the opportunity to demonstrate, here is a capability we are either lacking in, or it is not strong, or we don't have the bandwidth to really focus on this, but it is a need of the business. And it quickly becomes easier, I won't say easy, to justify the business case why you need to expand your team. Over the years, I've been in situations where I've been kicked in the teeth where you go say, I need more resources. More resources for what? Well, we can't do as much as we could if we had another That's not a compelling business case to a business leader. If you can be laser focused and say the demand, and this goes back to the operating model. If your operating model is clear, you can quickly start to surgically identify where are there gaps in terms of skills and resources based on that. When everyone does everything, it becomes very muddied and difficult to start to explain, well, we need another resource. Resource for what? Resource for this. Well, can't this other person just spend more of their time doing that? It becomes very muddy and difficult to do that. Where if you're more specialized and you can showcase, here's our operating model, here's how things are moving through our operating model, here's the bottleneck within our operating model, and what resource and what skills we need to free that up to ultimately meet your needs. And if we don't get that resource, then these things are going to be something we're going to have to say we don't have the capacity or the capability to do. It no longer becomes a personal, do you see value in L&D or not? It becomes a business discussion around, these are capabilities that the organization is asking of us. Here is what we have from a capacity standpoint. Here is our operating model. Here is where that gap exists. And then you can objectively say, I could not move resources from this. First of all, one, we don't have the skill specialization in that. Secondly, if we take from that and move it over here, we've just created another bottleneck. Again, you remove the emotion, the personal flavor out of that discussion, and it truly becomes a business operations discussion around what is the capacity and capability of the team and what does that look like. So for a small team, that may not be we have these robust roles, but even within that, if you have done a good job in hiring out a diverse team of professionals, there are natural strengths and opportunities in your teams. And that doesn't necessarily mean you need to build everybody up to the same capacity. You may say, this person really has, in a small organization, you may say, this person really has a affiliation with design. They're a much better designer than this. It's not a greater than or less than, but you may lean on that person to do more of the design work versus someone who's doing more of the delivery work. And I think that's in small organizations where you can start to do that. And then again, that leads to a building conversation where you start to talk about what you would need to grow the organization. So as you start talking about this operating model, it's not as simple as slapping a double diamond or laying out a workflow or process flow and going, here's how this works. It really ties back to how is my organization designed around this? Where do the people map on this? How does that fit? What does that lead our capability? You may find you're over indexed in certain areas, and you may within your own teams need to grow or shift skills, which can be difficult conversations. It can also be really helpful conversations, because no doubt when I've talked to people in our field, there are lots of people who have been pigeonholed into certain capabilities of L&D that is not necessarily their comfort zone or their bread and butter, but that's just where they've been put because that's the role they were hired into, or it's been assumed that that's just what we're going to have you do. And actually doing this allows you to open up to the team and say, here's how we're going to operate. Where are the areas that you really see working well? And I think ultimately, if you do this well, it builds a stronger foundation that allows you to achieve greater things and be more objective about what is the capability, what is the capacity, what are the resources that we're actually doing, what can we accomplish as a team, versus this more subjective, here's what we're doing today, we want to do more of that, or people are burned out, they're stretched too thin. That's not terribly compelling. If even for me, if that request is coming to me, I need another resource, people are stretched too thin. My follow-up question is, how so? Demonstrate to me and show me what is the capacity of people right now? What are they doing? Could we be more efficient? If the answer is no, well, then that conversation of we need another resource absolutely opens up. Again, even from a capability. And the more you grow, the more specialized you can become. So if you're a small organization, I don't anticipate that your org design is going to have a complicated, overarching, lots of nuanced roles for lots of different things. You may have a more general, we've got these big buckets. Mine personally looks much more like a product team than a traditional L&D team. Again, I would recommend going back to my skills session if you didn't see that, where you can see the way our operating model ties to a product structure, how we do intake, how we design, how we measure, how we push that through, and how all that's monitored. Again, not to say that everyone needs to copy and paste what that is, but I think if anything, as we wrap up 2022 and move into 2023, putting an intentional focus on this would pay dividends for any L&D organization. You may go into it and find out you have a well-defined operating model, something that is cleaned up, but you may find opportunities where you go, this portion, we need to do some work, and that's going to open up greater capacity for us to do better and bigger and more measurable things in 2023. One other closing thought on this that I'm going to add before I transition into the skill analytics L&D measurement conversation is the how to use technology in your operating model and org design. This was a conversation I had the other day with someone where we had a dialogue about how should we use technology when it comes to org design and operations. And too often I see a tendency where we take our existing operating model and then we look out to the technology and attempt to force fit that technology back into what we're doing today. Now, it's not to say that never is the right way to approach it. I don't want to make a blanket statement and say you should never do that, because you may have a well-oiled operation and you say, we have opportunity to do this better, in which case then that may define requirements that allows you to go look for technology that allows you to do this. At the same time, one of the biggest opportunities I see missed is when we are not aware of what is possible with the latest in technology, and we design a legacy org structure and legacy operating model, not letting the possibilities of what technology can do influence that org design. Now, this is where there's a little bit of a enigma that you have to dance around, in that you may not be at a state of maturity or readiness where that new technology or that new capability can truly influence your org design. And that's not to say you do it and go, well, I guess we'll just wait and see what happens. You may have to make some intentional decisions, difficult decisions around, we know this is where we're going. We aren't there yet. So we're going to design our org or our process around this, but at least having that future forward look at that. Now, let me give a really practical example of this. This is the example I used the other day. Automation and AI is going to dramatically change what the role of an instructional designer is in terms of the work that they do and how their time is spent, which can sound very frightening if you're an instructional designer saying, well, what does that mean? Does that mean AI might do my job? Well, if your job is just to sort through PowerPoint decks and rearrange them into e-learning authoring tool, then yes, automation very well may replace what that capability is. Knowing that, you may say, are we at a state of readiness where we have automation? Is it at a state of maturity? Are we ready to bring in some technology that may take that capability away or the need for that in our org? Maybe not now, but the opportunity you have right now is to know that automation is going to dramatically change what's required of an instructional designer. That rote going through things, reorganizing content, a machine is far better equipped to do that at speed and scale than an instructional designer. And the instructional designer's role then is to review, architect, really work with the stakeholders on manage. It's a different kind of role. So you may say, we're not ready to do that yet, or the technology is not at a state of maturity where we think we can just hand that over yet. But what you don't want to do is ignore that and then completely design a talent set and a roadmap around a legacy instructional design role, knowing that the technology is coming and is going to dramatically change that. If you have this future forward look and say, here's what the technology is capable of doing and how it's going to influence the way these roles change, you can then back into, so what does the roadmap for, and again, I'm just fleshing out this use case, what does the roadmap for a learning designer or an experience designer look like over the next 2 to 3 years? Let's build that into the development plans and into the org design of our teams, knowing that that's where we're going or that where we'd like to go. Now, where I say you have to be careful with this is that if you pull the trigger too early, there may be too large of a gap and you may be making promises or writing checks you can't cash, which may leave your teams going, and I've been in this situation. We keep talking about this, where we want to get, and we're not there yet. And it can lead to a sense of frustration in teams going, I was really hoping to get there. Now, I will tell you there's challenges of getting along the way, but that's just one consideration and caution to think about. But ultimately, my point is, don't just design all your org and operations and then look to the technology and say, how do we just get technology that helps us do what we design better? Really be intentional. And this is going back to the skills conversation. I said I wasn't going to talk too much about this, but this is why the need to build your digital acumen and know what the capabilities is extremely important so that it can inform and influence your operating model and your strategy. If you have any questions, feel free to throw them in, but I'm going to pause there and I'll take additional questions from folks in the community, or if they come up, I'll jump back to it. So I don't run out of time, I want to jump to the skill analytics and L&D measurement conversation, which the reason I break it up, there's two parts as we think about our function going into 2023 and through the remainder of 2022. The first one is less about the measurement conversation and more about the skill analytics piece. This has been a difficult area for a long time in terms of understanding what is it that we need to prioritize. Now, this all again ties back to your L&D operations. Where are the true skill gaps? Not the knee-jerk reaction, something happened in the organization and someone said we need training, but where are the true skill development opportunities in the organization? Now, I think there's a fair amount that we can pull from to start to build that strategy. But one of the things that I encourage L&D leaders to take a look at that has matured significantly 2 years ago on Learning Tech Talks, I identified this as one of the biggest opportunity areas in the HR and learning tech market was skill analytics. There's a lot of things out there claiming that they do skill measurement and mobility. But when you scratch beneath the surface and say, how are you truly assessing the thumbprint of someone's skill? There's not a whole lot to it. Fair amount of smoke and mirrors. That has changed significantly. And so when I talk to learning leaders throughout, there's a real opportunity to, as I would say, supercharge our analytics with skill data. So that as we start forming our strategy, as we start prioritizing for 2023, we may not say, well, let's stick our finger in the air, take a pulse on what we think, and take our best stab at what the needs are. There are some players out there that really are focusing on triangulating and rapidly, not over the next 2-3 years, we pull all this data, but rapidly looking at what is the overall skill heat map of your organization standpoint so that you can really zone in on where should we focus, not based on gut feel, not based on conversations that are happening, not based on these anecdotal pieces of evidence, but quantitative evidence saying we've assessed the organization and triangulated that overall, these are the overall skill opportunities in our org based on our business strategy. Again, a lot of this is tying us to having a more business-focused discussion with our HR and business talent partners. And not just saying, I think we need training on this, or what problems are you trying to solve? Let us go back to the well and see what we can come up with. But actually coming to the table with, we have done analytics on this and we have triangulated that these are some of the biggest skill opportunities in the organization that we think we can focus on. Now, does that mean that you're going to always win the day and everyone's going to say, great, thanks, those will be our priorities? No, but there is this opportunity to lean in and actually come with some quantitative data around, we've taken a look across the organization. This is what we're seeing in the heat map of skills based on the business priorities we have. We think these are some of the biggest opportunities that we can develop on, knowing, and again, this goes back to boss, I will tie this to your comment about communicating with business partners. There is a lead time leading up to these conversations, because at the end of the day, there is work to be done. I was on a panel this morning talking about this. Developing skills is not something that happens quickly through a YouTube video or a micro-learning course. You don't watch a micro-learning course and then boom, you're now better at navigating organizational politics or communicating, being agile, things like that. That actually takes time and effort. And what this allows us to do is to have some hard data around, these are some of the biggest skills that we know are going to take time and resources for us to rally around and say, we need to architect experiences around these skills. Let's prioritize these, because the reality is the data is out there. People cannot change 20, 30, 40 skills over the course of a year. In reality, they can only handle a couple strategic skills that they can really build towards over a period of time. So what this supercharging your analytics strategy allows you to do is say, here's the data. Again, going back to this objective business conversation. Here's what the data says about the skills that we have in our organizations. Here's what we know, again, tying to your business operating model. If you don't have a clear operating model and know what kind of process it takes for you to actually architect an experience that's going to develop skills, this whole thing falls in on itself, because that can no longer be a business discussion around, here's the skills we've identified overall. Let's do an exercise and prioritize what do we think are the most critical skills for our business based on the strategy that we're looking to achieve. Let's nail those down, because we know we can't do 20, 30. We can do a handful. And here's why, because here's our operating model and what it would take for us to actually architect and implement a holistic learning solution intervention that's going to move the needle in these kind of behavior changes, and then actually do something with that. And now you can have this discussion around that instead of just reacting to business priority shifts or things like that, you can become more strategic in the way that you're planning this. Now, the way I've described this may sound like an oversimplification, and people who are in this space may say there's a lot more to it. There absolutely is. I was on another panel last week where we talked about, actually, one of my posts last week talked about the fact that this is not done in the silo of L&D. I didn't mention this in here, but this is where there's a real opportunity for us to partner up with our other talent partners and say, this isn't just something we can do as an L&D team. We need to think about this in the way we recruit and assess talent. We need to think about this in the way we mobilize and manage our talent, the way we do workforce planning. We need to connect with these partners so that we can start saying, hey, if this is a big strategic change in our organization, we can come to the table now and say, here's the analytics we have around the skills we have. Here's what we know it takes for us to actually deploy and do something strategic that's going to make a dent, versus we scatter some more training out, spray and pray some training and hope that something changes. If you want us to do something that's actually going to make a dent, and the way I framed it the other day, drive measurable behavior change, this is what that looks like. So that you can start planning and be part of this. We talk a lot about wanting a seat at the table, but being able to have a seat at the table is being able to come to the table with something other than a reaction to what's happening at the table. It's us bringing something of value that someone else isn't. But this, again, is a partnership that we have to think about across functional lines. This isn't something we should be doing in a silo, but it's an opportunity in many organizations that I see. It's not necessarily happening, and L&D has a unique opportunity to step in and say, we want to play here. We want to play here because this is something we're really good at. We have a point of view on this. We know how it can be done. We have the players, we have the skills, we have the talents to do something about it. And stepping up and going, we're going to own this. Now, granted, with that comes accountability, which, let me make a timestamp, because as I said, this is going to tie to my chapter thing. But this is where we also have to do this around our measurement piece. And this is one of those areas that comes up a lot in our industry as we talk about measurement and how do we measure the impact and the ROI of what we're doing. If you're doing all these things right, this will come naturally. And that may seem distant, like that may seem out there, but it really, I can tell you from experience that this is true, that if you get your operating model right, you know the way your org runs, you know the efficiencies and process and the time that goes through it, you start to have these more strategic skill discussions around this is what behaviors we're looking to change in the organization. We're now connecting that to strategic business priorities around this is what we're trying to achieve. We're having that conversation. We're saying, here's the skills that are tied to it. When it comes to the measurement piece, we can start to think about, and I think this is the opportunity area. Sometimes in the measurement, I see us swing too far in one of two ways. Either one, we do very little with it, and we say, we'll capture some impact data. We'll maybe randomly pull some HR reports around culture, employee well-being, retention. We'll see if there's some movement, try and back end into, is there something that we did? And then we have our engagement numbers. That's one thing. The other end of that spectrum that I've seen doesn't always go very well or rarely goes well is when we start capitalizing on these business metrics and in an attempt to just demonstrate that we did something, we're trying to correlate movement in those business metrics to something that we did when we really didn't put the operational diligence into on the front end saying, if this is the business metric or this is the thing, the initiative we're trying to impact, here's how that ties to human behavior and the L&D interventions, not holistically, but here are the components that we can own. Here's what we think we can do and what it's going to take to do it. Those measurements naturally fall in place. And then you can look at those lag metrics to see, did it have the ultimate effect we were hoping to? I did a community-only podcast this month where I went in way more detail than I will have time to in this conversation about this topic to start to say, okay, how are we actually thinking about this? Now, the one thing I will say is, does that mean that you never look at this? And let me try and Melissa, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, so my apologies if I didn't, is yes, we need to refresh this data. There is value at looking at some of these, and I completely agree that it is about mixing the qualitative with the quantitative. It's not that we abandon this. And I think this is where I see the pendulum swing. People go down the ROI path. They try and do that. They realize this is a difficult thing to do. It's very challenging. We can't ever conclusively say we've had this impact on this. And then we walk away from it. We walk away from it and we go back to, well, how many e-learnings were done in the LMS? How many completions did we have? How many people showed up to training and told us it was a life-changing event for them and they loved everything about us? We don't have to play in either of those spaces. We can play in the middle where we say all of the measurement is adding value, even the engagement metrics. I've had conversation about this before where people are saying, well, there's no value in level 1 of assessments. I disagree with that. I think there's huge value in level 1 assessments. They tell us part of the story. The problem is when we end with that story and then present that as though that's the whole story. I think that's one of the biggest misses is when we get into it and say, here is all the completion data. Here are all the smile sheets that we got. Aren't we doing a wonderful job? That's an incomplete story. That's starting with the first couple chapters and saying, wasn't that a great book? No, it's not telling the whole story. But that doesn't mean you throw out the first few chapters and say, well, that was a waste of time. We're going to dump that with everything else. We say, well, no, what part does that play in the story? And maybe that's not a part of the story we represent to our business audience. I think that's another opportunity as we start thinking about program and impact analytics. When we look at instructional design, what is one of the first things that we take into account? Who is our audience? Who is our audience? We need to do that same thing when we think about measurement and the way we actually are measuring things. We need to say, well, who ultimately is a stakeholder we're reporting out to? Do they care about completions? Maybe they do, maybe they don't. That may be more for us on the internal side that tells us, listen, if everybody's saying that they're not enjoying our courseware or they are not getting value out of the live programs we're delivering, that should affect our design. That should be helping us identify when is there a program we have in our portfolio that instead of just focusing on something new, we need to take a step back and say, hang on a second here. We need to prioritize this like we would prioritize a new request because the data is telling us people aren't finding value. It's not driving impact on their jobs. We need to actually prioritize this. I think this helps address one of the challenges that we often run into as a function where there's too much to do. So we end up just creating new things and stacking on top of what we did. And we never go back and say, well, what about the existing stuff? When do we kill something or completely renovate it because it's no longer there? It's the same principles apply to your house. When you're renovating your house, at some point you say this pink cabinetry and laminate countertops have reached a dated age where I think it's time to renovate our kitchen. We have to be able to do that. And some of those metrics that we pull in our front end actually help inform that. Another thing that I will add in terms of the analytics that I think is worth mentioning, it ties to our operating model. Too often, if we don't, well, not too often, if we don't have our operating model in order, it is nearly impossible to pull and monitor internal operating analytics. So when someone comes to us and says, here's what we need, how long is that going to take? We might be able to go out to the industry, pull some best practices around how many hours go into every hour of training. But in many regards, that's assuming one modality. That may not assume any sort of level of complexity of what we're dealing with. If we don't have our operating model in order, it becomes very difficult for us to be able to quantify and articulate to folks, here's what we actually have the capacity to do, so that instead of us just taking on more and feeling overwhelmed, or the opposite is always pushing back and saying, we don't have capacity, we don't have capacity, we don't have capacity, which ultimately just ticks people off. And then they either go hire other folks and we become, trying to defend our jobs, or we just are constantly in this battle defending what our priorities are. If we don't have that operating model in place, it becomes very difficult to articulate. Here's what our process looks like. Here's the volume of things we're managing. Here's how we're coming to the conclusion on what we're prioritizing. Here's what we're scoping out. And here's what we're thinking the timelines. And then actually start tracking. Are we following through on that? Because that's a big thing that doesn't always happen in the conversations that we have, where just take a practical example anyone in L&D can relate to, where you signed up for something that sounded easy on the intake. oh, we have a need for, I don't even know what, help designing some, I'm not even going to say, light performance support resource for this new initiative that's going to go alongside. Sounds easy. That sounds like it should be something we can whip up in a week. How often does that then turn into, well, it's not just that. We also need to have some webinars. Can we have you help us do this? Why don't we do also some videos that go along with that? And while you're at it, could you set up a performance support portal where we can keep all these resources? And could you do the change management and communications alongside all of that? That job aid project, how often does that job aid project turn into something else? If we don't have our operating model defined and laid out, it becomes very difficult to justify this. And then it's hard to articulate why we either need additional resources, why we're deprioritizing things, why we're not working on certain things, or how we're making the decisions we are on this. And I think that's one of the things when it comes to measurement. A lot of the conversations I see around measurement are around Kirkpatrick and all of these other things in terms of measuring the impact of what we're doing and all of that. One of the greatest opportunities I would encourage people to think about as we think about the rest of 2022 and 2023 in tying with our operating model is how are we going to measure the effectiveness of things moving through our process so that we can start to baseline and talk about here's what we're actually not only delivering and the impact that it's having, but here's actually what's going into that so that when you're looking at that line item in your budget and your CFO is saying, what are we getting for this? Instead of just looking at the output and arguing over whether you had the impact you did, you can start to say, yeah, but look at all of this stuff that we did. Look at all of these initiatives, all these projects that we were engaged in. Here's where it started. And we can't undersell the value of people coming to us saying, we need training on this. And then talking about the fact that, well, we came to a different conclusion. Work went into that. We need to be able to quantify that and say, this is value saved to the organization. This was something that maybe we engaged with that could have ended up costing the organization time, money, resources. We were able to convert it to something that had a better impact and was faster, took less time. We were able to come to the market quicker with that. And I think that's one of the things that oftentimes when I see the conversation around measurement, that is not on the table at all right now. Every measurement conversation I'm in is always about the impact of our work, whether people like it, whether it's driving business results, whether it's tied to this. We often are not looking at the measurement of how are we performing. And sometimes I think it's because it would be a really hard look in the mirror. And I can say that from my own personal experience, that there have been plenty of times where I've had to look in the mirror at what is our operations. And it's not pretty. It's not pretty to actually go, oof, we're kind of a mess. We don't have a nice, clean model that we're running things through. That said, that's why I think as we wrap up 2022 and move into 2023, there's an opportunity for us to say, well, that may be where it is. So what are we going to do about it? And let's actually take some work. Let's define our operating model. Let's figure out how tech fits into that. Let's define our org. And then let's actually define some metrics along the way so that we can say, we want to engage with X number of projects by this. We want to convert X number of requests for training into something else by the end of the year so that we can start measuring and quantifying our value in different ways. Because again, going back to our stakeholders, different stakeholders are going to assess our value differently. And if we are only collecting and managing one set of data around that, we're actually missing a huge opportunity and someone may not care about that value. And if we have nothing more than that value, we're at risk of being able to show value to a wide variety of audiences. Okay, so the last piece that I'll have time for today is to touch on the L&D technology. Maybe I'll do a session, I'll pre-record something specifically on some of the things to watch in 2023. I have 4 of them. There's actually probably about 10 that I would encourage people to at least keep their eye on that I won't even be able to tie into because we're already coming to the end of the time. But one of the things that as we look at the L&D technology for the end of 2022 and 2023, one of the biggest opportunities I see for everyone that I encounter and talk to about this is what I would call, there's lots of the greats right now, the great resignation, the great reprioritization, the great this and that. I actually think when it comes to L&D and workplace and HR tech, I think the end of 2022 and 2023, it's a great time for the great cleanup. That is something that a lot of organizations that I've worked with, when the pandemic hit and things changed dramatically, and we've been in a state of change for several years now. So it's not a new thing, but it's been such a rapid fire series of changes and such a dramatic shift. We weren't sure if people were coming back to the office. They were, then they weren't, then they might, some might, we might not. That whole thing has changed so many times. The businesses are changing, business transformation is happening all over. What happened at the beginning of 2020 and really over the past year and a half, 2 years, there was this huge insurgence of people going out and getting new tools, new tech, trying new things to see, hey, could this help us solve this problem? One of the challenges with all of this is you start layering this stuff on. If you're never intentional about taking the time back and saying, how are we actually using this? What is the impact that we're having with this? Is this actually changing our operation? Again, tying to the business operating model. If we haven't defined our operating model, let's look at what we have now. Let's figure out what we can do or what we could do, and then let's potentially purge some of these things. This is something that I personally have done, and I do on a fairly regular basis. I don't do this just when a pandemic hits, but there's always this tendency to keep stacking on new and more. And there's often not enough time put into, but let's take a look back and say, is all of this adding value? Now, sometimes that may happen when a recurring invoice or a renewal comes up, but a lot of times we wait until that happens. And I've been there myself. The response can be, well, we maybe don't really need this right now, but I don't want to change things immediately. And then time goes by, the renewal comes due the following year, the year after that. And we just end up in this cycle of we've now just stacked so many tools, so many technologies. Our workforce is starting to get to a state of stability. I don't know that it's totally stable, but we're getting to a level of, okay, this whole hybrid thing, it's not going away. We're never going to be able to count on people being at any one location at any given time. People are going to be bouncing back. Things are going to be changing at a pace that is likely not going to slow down. So what does that require of us to be able to meet that need and do that well? And I think even just from my own experience, there's lots of new things that when things were in this state of crazy, we thought, let's try this out and see what it does. Let's see if this helps us or has an impact on that. There's also things that we may have acquired that we had high aspirations of trying that we may not have had capacity because things were moving so fast. We didn't have the opportunity to actually put the time and intention into it. A good example of this that I see a lot is user-generated content or co-created content, which was the topic of StoryTagger last week. There's been this big push in our industry, and this is just one use case, to say, how are we using our audience more, our employees more in creating and curating content? And there's some tools out there that I know myself, others have acquired saying we should do this, thinking that the tool would solve it or would be a relatively easy lift, that we say, well, there was a lot more work to it than we thought. We weren't able to put the time and energy into it that we thought we could. And now we have to make this decision of, are we going to put the time and energy into it and actually get the lift that we need? Or are we going to say, I don't know that this is really something that at this time is going to be something we're going to put the time and energy into doing. And so at this point, I think there's a real unique opportunity for us to look at that, especially if you're taking the time, which again, I've said, this is something I think everybody should be doing, taking the time to look at your operating model, look at the technology you have or the technology that you have the possibility of having or how that's moving, and then reflecting back and saying, what should we be doing? And this is not only just a wise use of our resources in saying, well, okay, budget season's coming, we're closing in on budget, we're going to be asked questions and we're going to be asked, what do you need for 2023? Again, there's this tendency to always be growing and adding new things. But a lot of times, myself included, there's things that we had the best intentions of putting time and energy into that either proved to not do what we thought it could, and we need to actually pull away from that and not necessarily say it's bad, or that there's no value in doing it. I think that's sometimes a risk we can run into, is just because it didn't work for our situation or the time, that it somehow is ineffective or something we should abandon. Maybe not, but there is this time right now to take this intentional look at it and say, what did we do? What did we try? What do we now have within our portfolio? Is there opportunity as we look to 2023 to say, you know what, here's a capability that went vastly underutilized that maybe we could do more with. Maybe we could use this tool in our design. Maybe our virtual classroom stuff, we threw it into Zoom because we had to move fast. We didn't really take the time to build it into a robust experience. This is where all this stuff I'm talking about, from my perspective, is all interconnected, and it's not which one do you choose. It's a matter of how do you choose it and integrate them all together. Because as you start doing this, as you start looking at your operating model, as you start gathering the skill analytics you have, as you start calculating what kinds of measures internally and externally are we going to start doing, you're going to have an opportunity to look at your technology stack and say, what do we really have here? The other thing that I encourage people, or I encourage vendors a lot, which if I have vendors listening to this, I tell you all the time, don't let being on Learning Tech Talks be a one-time thing. I can't count the number of technologies and platforms that I talk to that what they are 12 months ago and the capability that they have now is so vastly different. There may be a strategic opportunity for us to look at, well, are there things that maybe we didn't turn on or we didn't take full advantage of because we didn't have the time or capacity to do? But now that this is becoming an intentional focus for our group, let's put that discipline. Let's put that discipline into it. We're now specializing as an org. Maybe this is a stretch opportunity for some people on our team to say, you know what, we bought this live virtual tool to try and make our live virtual sessions more engaging. We never really did a whole lot with it. Someone who really wants to grow their skills in facilitation, we may say, take a look at this. How could we use this more? Is there value in it, so that rather than waiting until the renewal comes and then we have to make a snap decision on whether or not we use it, we can go back to it. I just even think of some of the things, just to give an example of this in personal. So Descript. Descript is a tool I use for my podcasting and things like that. That platform, that tool has changed so much in the last 12 months. 12 months ago, I was rarely utilizing it for what it could do because there wasn't a whole lot I needed. Now it's a completely different tool set with storyboarding, and the way I can create content in there is completely different than it was. And I think that's something that, had I not taken the time to go back and look at the product map and say, what new features, what new functionality has been added? How are the workflows of those technologies changing? What's possible in here? I wouldn't have found that. And I can tell you, in multiple conversations that I have with people, there are lots of times where I hear people talking about tools that they have, and they're making statements about them that I know for a fact from personal experience are based on legacy data, legacy information. Maybe you haven't really fleshed into some of the details of this. And I think as we go into the end of 2022, lean on your more tech savvy folks on the team to say, let's dig into this. Let's take a look at this tool that we have. What really could we be doing with it? And as we prepare for 2023, maybe let's come up with some design jams as a team and talk about what are some creative ways that we might be able to use these tools in the content we design, in the way we manage our operations. What programs do we have that we could augment with some other assets or capabilities using the tools that we have? I think sometimes, DevLearn was last week. It's so easy in this conference season to go out and see the new shiny object and say, man, if we had that, just imagine what we could do, instead of really taking inventory of what do we have and are we getting the full capacity out of that? And maybe you're not. And I've been in this situation where maybe you're not, and that's okay. That's when you make that intentional decision to say, we're going to cease to use this. And that is an important step, because if you don't do that, not only are you not freeing up time and resources, you're actually adding clutter to the end user experience, which can actually make it more difficult for your own internal L&D teams, but also for your end users. I think sometimes we want to express our creativity and do lots of new and different things. But at the end of the day, if you think about yourself as an employee, they're fatigued, they're tired. They're just trying to make it to the end of the day in many cases. To them, this idea of relearning a new UX or trying to figure out a new tool because we think it's great and there's this whole new initiative. Going back to what we said with behavior change, people can only handle so much. And while we may be excited about something, our workforce may not be. And that's not a knock on us saying there's no value in what they're doing. It's about us bending our will to theirs and saying, what do you really need? And how do we provide consistency while still improving the impact? Now, that doesn't mean you never change tools, you never move things, you never bring in new technology, but it's done with a discipline, a discernment, and an intention that allows it to be a real positive change and opens up time and resources to be able to commit to it wholeheartedly and get the full value out of it. So surprisingly, I was pretty good on time there. So I was able to get through the whole agenda minus the things to watch for from a tech standpoint. So I may do a separate session just on looking back at some of the things I've seen. The skill analytics piece is one I highlighted today in terms of rapid rise in that. So I may do another session on that. But again, thank you, all of you who were able to join live. I hope you found something valuable in this conversation. If you're not part of the community, I will again plug that. Feel free to join and ask follow-up questions through that, or LinkedIn. You can DM me, and I'm usually pretty good at getting back to that. And if you have ideas for topics or suggestions, please let me know. And if I have time before my little bit of a sabbatical from creating content on LinkedIn, I may find some time to create some additional content that I will push out during that quiet season. So with that, I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your Tuesday. Happy November. Still hard to believe that I'm saying happy November already. I hope you have a great rest of your week, and we will see you back next week where I will be back to the usual lineup. We will be talking about tech, which let me take a look here what that is. I think next week is, no, of course I didn't do it right. Here, hang on. Next week is, I'm talking to Katie Peters. Well, not Katie Peters. I'm talking with Valamis. So we're going to be talking leader learning experience. And actually, this is one, they are heavily focused on the analytics piece. So we will likely be getting into the conversation on what's possible in terms of analytics from your learning experience platform and how might we think about that from the end user standpoint. So I hope you all have a great rest of your week. We will see you on the other side. Talk to you later.